Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most famous discoveries in human history, the opening of the tomb of Tutankhamun, the boy king of ancient Egypt whose death was quiet, but whose afterlife became anything but. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the dry, unforgiving heat of 1922, deep within the Valley of the Kings, a man named Howard Carter stood staring at a sealed doorway that had not been opened for over 3,000 years. At that point, most reasonable people might consider that a hint, maybe even a polite suggestion from history itself. Hey, let's not. Unfortunately, archaeology as a profession is built on the exact opposite instinct. Behind that doorway lay the tomb of Tutankhamun, a young king who ruled briefly, died young, and was buried with enough gold to make modern billionaires feel slightly underdressed. We're talking chariots, statues, jewellery, furniture. Basically an entire Royal IKEA catalogue for the afterlife, except everything is solid gold and weighs more than your car. Carter and his team had spent years searching for this tomb. Years of digging, sweating, and probably questioning their life choices under the Egyptian sun. By the time they found it, walking away was not an option. This was the kind of discovery that gets your name into history books, or depending on how things go, into a very different kind of list. So naturally they decided to open it. Now, ancient Egyptians were very clear about one thing. Do not mess with the dead. They had spells, rituals, protective symbols, the whole package. They essentially invented the world's first private property warning, except instead of a sign, it came with divine consequences. And Carter looked at all of that and thought, yes, but have we considered ignoring it completely? When he made a small hole in the sealed entrance and held up a candle, the flame flickered in the stale, ancient air. Air that hadn't been disturbed since people still thought pyramids were a fresh new idea. When asked what he could see, he famously said, "Wonderful things," which is a great answer, but also slightly concerning. Because if you ever open a 3,000-year-old tomb and your first thought is wonderful, you're probably overlooking a few important details. Like survival, what he was actually breathing in was centuries of dust, spores, and whatever microscopic horrors had been quietly waiting in that sealed environment. No masks, no filters, just straight into the lungs like it's a luxury spa treatment called Ancient Mold Experience. Because here's the thing, this wasn't just a treasure vault. It was a perfectly preserved time capsule, and time capsules are not designed with ventilation in mind. The moment that seal was broken, something changed. Not dramatically. No curses glowing on the walls. No sudden ominous music. Just a quiet, invisible shift. And as history would soon show, those are usually the worst kind. That small hole in the doorway didn't just reveal wonderful things. It marked the exact moment 3,000 years of silence officially ended, and a group of very confident humans decided they were fully qualified to deal with whatever came next. Once Howard Carter and his team confirmed the tomb was intact, there was no going back. The entrance was widened, tools came out, and history, along with a questionable amount of ancient air, began pouring out into the modern world. Now, to be fair, their excitement was justified. Inside lay one of the greatest archaeological finds ever, the untouched burial of Tutankhamun. Not looted, not destroyed, just sitting there, patiently waiting for someone to ruin the perfect preservation streak. But here's where things get less glamorous. The tomb had been sealed since roughly 1323 BCE. That means the air inside wasn't just old, it was ancient, completely undisturbed. No airflow, no sunlight, no fresh oxygen. Just a closed environment where bacteria, mold and fungi had all the time in the world to settle in and make themselves comfortable. And then suddenly, tourists. Well, technically archaeologists, but from the microbes' perspective, same thing. As the team moved deeper inside, they stirred up layers of fine dust that had been resting peacefully for millennia. Every step, every movement, every excited "look at this" sent tiny particles into the air. Particles no one could see, but everyone was breathing. No masks, no protective gear. Just raw confidence and a strong belief that being British in the 1920s made you immune to microscopic threats. Spoiler, it did not. And yet, nothing immediately went wrong. No one dropped dead on the spot. No mysterious shadow appeared in the corner. Everything seemed fine. Which, in hindsight, is exactly how most bad situations begin. Because the real danger wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. It was slow, invisible, patient. Meanwhile, the outside world was just beginning to hear about the discovery. News spread quickly, and with it came fascination, envy, and just a hint of unease. Because even back then, people understood one thing about ancient tombs. They are not meant to be opened, and yet here we were, stepping inside, breathing deeply and acting surprised that disturbing a sealed chamber from another era might come with side effects. But don't worry. At this point, everyone was still alive. For now. At first, everything seemed fine. The tomb had been opened, treasures catalogued, and Howard Carter was quickly becoming the most famous archaeologist on the planet. But as news of the discovery spread, something else began to grow alongside it. A story far more powerful than gold. The curse. It didn't start inside the tomb. In fact, that's the funny part. Despite what movies and dramatic documentaries would have you believe, there was no clearly written message in Tutankhamun's burial chamber saying, "Congratulations, you opened this, now you die." Ancient Egyptians loved writing things down, but they weren't exactly into subtle horror one-liners. Instead, the idea of a curse was born outside, in newspapers, whispers, and a public that was already fascinated by ancient Egypt's obsession with death and the afterlife. And honestly, it didn't take much convincing. You have a sealed tomb, a young dead king, a culture deeply invested in protecting the dead, and now a group of foreigners casually walking in, touching everything, and probably saying things like, "We'll just take this back to the museum." If there was ever a situation that felt cursed, this was it. Journalists quickly realized they had a gold mine, not just in artifacts, but in storytelling. Headlines began hinting at ancient warnings, divine punishment, and mysterious consequences. The narrative practically wrote itself, and once people start believing in something like that, logic quietly packs its bags and leaves the room. Soon, rumours spread of inscriptions threatening death to those who disturbed the king's rest. Most of these were either exaggerated or completely invented, but that didn't matter. The public wasn't asking for accuracy. They were asking for drama, and drama they got. The idea of a curse tapped into something deeper. Fear of the unknown. Fear of death. And the uncomfortable feeling that maybe, just maybe, some things aren't meant to be uncovered, especially when they've been left alone for 3,000 years without complaint. Even members of the expedition weren't entirely immune. You can be a rational, educated person. But if enough people around you start talking about curses, and you're standing inside a tomb filled with ancient symbols of death, your brain starts to reconsider a few things, just in case. Because here's the truth. The curse didn't need to be real. It just needed to be believed. And once it was, every strange event, every illness, every unfortunate coincidence suddenly had an explanation. One that was far more exciting than bacteria, bad luck, or poor medical care. The stage was set. All it needed now was a death. And right on cue, the story got its first victim. Enter Lord Carnarvon, the man who financed the entire expedition. Without him, Howard Carter is still out there digging politely in the sand, hoping for the best. With him, history gets rewritten, and then, very quickly, gets a lot more uncomfortable. A few months after the tomb was opened, Carnarvon fell ill. Now, what caused it? Brace yourself for something deeply anticlimactic. A mosquito bite. Yes, not a glowing curse, not a supernatural force, just a mosquito. The same tiny, annoying creature that ruins your summer nights and somehow still hasn't been defeated by humanity. Truly the final boss of evolution. But here's where things take a turn. Carnarvon accidentally cut the bite while shaving. The wound became infected. The infection spread. And in a time before modern antibiotics were widely available, that was a very serious problem. Within days, his condition worsened, turning into blood poisoning. and shortly after, he died. Simple. Medical, unfortunate, but absolutely perfect for a curse narrative, because timing is everything. The moment news broke, the newspapers went wild. The man who funded the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb was dead. Not years later, not peacefully in his sleep, but suddenly, unexpectedly, and soon after disturbing the tomb. You couldn't have written a better script if you tried. And naturally, people started connecting dots that may or may not have existed. They pointed out eerie details, like reports that the lights in Cairo flickered or went out at the moment of his death, or that his dog miles away in England howled and dropped dead at the same time, which is either a chilling supernatural event or the kind of story that improves significantly with each retelling. The curse, until now just a rumour, suddenly felt real. Even those who didn't fully believe in it started to feel that quiet, creeping doubt. Because coincidence is easy to dismiss once, maybe twice, but when it lines up this perfectly, your brain starts doing that thing where it whispers, okay, but what if? Meanwhile, Howard Carter remained very much alive, which was slightly inconvenient for the whole curse theory. But no one really focused on that part. It didn't fit the narrative, and the narrative at this point was far more important than the truth, because now the curse had something it didn't have before, proof, or at least something that looked close enough. After the death of Lord Carnarvon, the story took on a life of its own. What had started as a rumour suddenly became a full-blown narrative. The tomb of Tutankhamun was cursed, and anyone who dared disturb it would pay the price. Now, here's the problem. Once people believe a pattern exists, they start finding it everywhere. And the newspapers, they were more than happy to help. Soon, any illness, accident, or mildly unfortunate event connected to the expedition was pulled into the spotlight. Someone gets sick? Curse. Someone dies years later from completely unrelated causes. Definitely the curse, just taking its time. Someone sneezes a bit too aggressively? Suspicious. It didn't matter how thin the connection was. If you had ever stood within 100 meters of the tomb, you were now part of the story. But when you actually step back, which, to be fair, is not something people do when they're enjoying a good mystery, the picture looks very different. Many of the people involved in opening the tomb lived long, uneventful lives. No sudden deaths, no mysterious illnesses, just normal aging, which, while less exciting, tends to be the leading cause of death for most humans. Howard Carter himself, the man who literally opened the tomb and spent years inside it, he lived for over a decade afterward. Not exactly the immediate divine punishment you'd expect from an all-powerful ancient curse with a clear grudge. But again, that part didn't make headlines, because man lives a normal life after opening tomb doesn't sell newspapers. Instead, the media focused on a handful of cases that could be interpreted as suspicious, carefully ignoring the much larger group of people who were perfectly fine. It's what we now call confirmation bias. But back then, it was just called good storytelling. And honestly, it worked. The idea of a curse is far more compelling than the reality of infections, environmental hazards, and early 20th century medicine doing its absolute best. Which wasn't always enough. But there was another factor at play, something less obvious, but just as powerful. Fear. Because once the idea of a curse takes hold, it doesn't just exist in newspapers. It starts living in people's minds. And when that happens, every headache feels more serious. Every cough feels more ominous. Every shadow looks slightly more intentional. At this point, the question wasn't just, is the curse real? It was, what happens if you believe it is? And as it turns out, that might be where things get truly dangerous. At some point, someone had to ruin the fun. Because while the world was busy imagining ancient curses and supernatural revenge, a few scientists quietly stepped in and said, what if it's just germs? I know. Disappointing. No glowing hieroglyphs, no invisible pharaohs floating around waiting for revenge. Just microscopic organisms doing what they've always done. Existing, multiplying, and occasionally ruining someone's day. Inside the sealed tomb of Tutankhamun, the conditions were perfect. No sunlight, stable temperature, complete isolation. In other words, an all-inclusive resort for mold, bacteria, and fungi. 3,000 years of uninterrupted growth. No cleaning staff, no ventilation. just layers of ancient biological material quietly building up over time. And then, suddenly, in walk a group of enthusiastic humans, kicking up dust like it's a celebratory event. Every step inside that tomb disturbed particles that had been resting for millennia. Tiny spores, invisible to the eye, were released into the air. And without modern protective equipment, guess where they went? Straight into the lungs. Now, for most healthy people, this might not be a huge problem. But if your immune system is already compromised, or if you're unlucky enough to inhale a particularly nasty batch, things can escalate quickly. Respiratory infections, allergic reactions, even serious illness. In other words, you don't need a curse when you have ancient mold with a 3,000-year head start. Some researchers have pointed to specific fungi, like aspergillus, which can thrive in enclosed environments and become dangerous when inhaled. It's not dramatic, it's not cinematic, but it's effective, and importantly, it's real. This theory also explains something the curse narrative conveniently ignores. Why not everyone died? Because exposure doesn't affect everyone equally. Some people get sick, others walk away completely fine. It depends on health, exposure levels, and a bit of good or bad luck. Not exactly the behaviour of a targeted supernatural punishment system, more like biology doing its thing. Of course, this explanation didn't capture the public imagination in quite the same way. Ancient spores cause respiratory issues doesn't have the same dramatic flair as Pharaoh curses intruders from beyond the grave. One sounds like a medical report, the other sounds like a movie. And guess which one people preferred? Still, as much as the curse made for a better story, the evidence was slowly pointing towards something far less mysterious and far more uncomfortable. Because if this theory is true, then the real danger wasn't something supernatural. It was something they were breathing the entire time. Even if you're not fully convinced by the whole ancient mold is trying to ruin your lungs theory, there's another equally comforting possibility. The air itself was a problem. Because here's something people tend to overlook. When you seal a chamber for 3,000 years, you're not preserving fresh air. You're preserving whatever chemical cocktail happened to be inside, and then letting it sit, undisturbed, for a very, very long time. Inside the tomb of Tutankhamun, the air wasn't just stale. It was ancient, chemically altered, and potentially dangerous. Organic materials, like oils, resins, fabrics, and even the remains of the burial itself, slowly break down over time. And when they do, they release gases. Now imagine those gases trapped in a sealed environment for millennia. Not exactly the kind of atmosphere you want to take a deep breath in. Some scientists have suggested the presence of gases like ammonia or hydrogen sulfide, substances that, in high enough concentrations, can irritate the lungs, cause dizziness, or worse. Even low oxygen levels alone could make people feel weak, confused, or unwell. But did Howard Carter and his team test the air before going in? Of course not. This was the 1920s. The general safety protocol was somewhere between "it'll probably be fine" and "we'll deal with it later." Masks weren't standard. Gas detectors weren't exactly part of the toolkit. Confidence, however, was in abundant supply. So they went in, repeatedly, breathing in whatever had been quietly marinating inside that tomb since the Bronze Age. And at first, nothing dramatic happened. No one collapsed immediately. No sudden theatrical reactions. Just subtle effects, fatigue, discomfort, maybe a headache here and there. The kind of symptoms you'd normally ignore, which is exactly what makes it dangerous. Because when something doesn't hit you all at once, it's easy to dismiss. You tell yourself it's just the heat, or the long hours, or the stress. You don't immediately think, "Ah, yes, ancient toxic gases are slowly affecting me." That would be ridiculous, and yet not entirely impossible. Combined with the bacteria and spores already floating around, the air inside the tomb becomes less of a neutral environment and more of a slow, invisible hazard. Not deadly in a dramatic, instant way, but potentially harmful over time, especially with repeated exposure. Which brings us back to the curse. Because if people start getting sick after spending time inside a sealed tomb filled with questionable air, what's easier to believe? A complex mix of environmental factors and biological exposure? Or an ancient king taking revenge from beyond the grave? Exactly. And once again, the more dramatic answer wins. Even if the real danger was something far simpler, and far more breathable. By this point, the tomb had already delivered everything a good story needs: mystery, treasure, a suspicious death, and a growing list of possibly cursed individuals. But there was one more ingredient quietly making everything worse: fear, not the dramatic scream-in-the-dark kind. No shadowy figures, no footsteps echoing behind you, just a slow, creeping awareness that maybe, just maybe, you've stepped into something you shouldn't have. And once that idea takes root, it doesn't leave easily. Because humans are incredibly good at one thing: convincing themselves something is wrong, especially when everyone around them is saying the same thing. The newspapers, the rumours, the whispers, all pointing to the same conclusion: the tomb of Tutankhamun is cursed. Now imagine you're part of that expedition. You've been inside the tomb, you've breathed the air, you've touched the artifacts, and suddenly you start hearing stories. Someone dies, then another gets sick, and every time something happens, people look at you just a little differently, like you're next. It doesn't matter how rational you are. That gets into your head. Stress builds. Sleep gets worse. Every small symptom, a headache, a cough, a bit of fatigue, suddenly feels significant. Not just I'm tired, but this might be it, which ironically is not a great mindset for staying healthy. Because fear has a physical effect. It weakens your immune system, raises stress hormones, makes your body less capable of fighting off actual infections, the kind we talked about earlier. So if there were bacteria, spores, or environmental toxins involved, fear didn't just sit there doing nothing. It made everything worse. It's like your body is already dealing with a problem, and then your brain decides to join in and say, hey, what if we panic too? Very helpful. There's even a phenomenon known as the nocebo effect, basically the opposite of a placebo. If you believe something will harm you, your body can start producing real symptoms, even if the cause isn't physically there. It's not imaginary. It's your mind triggering real physical reactions. So in a way, the curse didn't need to be real. The belief in the curse was enough. And once that belief spread, it created a perfect storm. Environmental risks, existing illnesses, and psychological stress all feeding into each other, making every outcome seem more mysterious than it actually was. Meanwhile, from the outside, it looked like something far more dramatic was happening. An ancient force, a warning ignored, a punishment unfolding. But inside the minds of the people involved, it was something quieter. A constant unsettling thought. What if they're right? By now, the story had everything it needed to spiral completely out of control. A mysterious tomb, a dead aristocrat, a growing sense of unease, and most importantly, an audience that couldn't get enough of it. Enter the media. In the early 20th century, newspapers were in fierce competition for attention, and nothing sells better than fear wrapped in a good story. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb wasn't just archaeology anymore. It was entertainment. And the curse angle? That was the headline goldmine. Suddenly, every detail was exaggerated, reshaped, or just completely invented for maximum dramatic effect. Stories began circulating about mysterious inscriptions warning of death. Reports claimed eerie events happened the moment Lord Carnarvon died. Lights going out across Cairo, strange animal behaviour, unexplained coincidences. The kind of details that sound incredibly convincing. Until you realise no one bothered to verify them. But verification isn't nearly as exciting as a good ghost story, and so the narrative grew. Journalists painted the tomb not as a historical discovery, but as a ticking time bomb of ancient vengeance. Every illness was reported as suspicious. Every death was linked, no matter how distant the connection. If someone had once shaken hands with someone who had visited the tomb, congratulations. You were now part of the curse story. It didn't matter if the timeline didn't make sense. It didn't matter if the cause of death was completely ordinary. What mattered was the pattern, or at least the illusion of one. Because once you start telling people that something is cursed, they begin to look for evidence everywhere. And the media was more than happy to provide it. Even Howard Carter, who remained alive and relatively unaffected, became part of the story. Not as proof that the curse wasn't real, but as an exception that made it seem even more mysterious. Why him? People wondered, as if the curse was carefully selecting its targets like a very patient and slightly dramatic villain. Meanwhile, the truth, the far less exciting explanation involving infections, environmental hazards, and coincidence was quietly pushed to the side. Because let's be honest, no one buys a newspaper for a detailed analysis of fungal spores. They buy it for headlines like, "Pharaoh's curse strikes again." And just like that, the story stopped being about what actually happened and started being about what people believed happened, which, as history has shown many times, is often far more powerful. Because once a story like this takes hold, it doesn't fade away, it spreads. And in this case, it spread far beyond the tomb itself. By this point, the curse had become unstoppable. Newspapers were printing it, people were whispering about it, and the story had officially taken on a life of its own. If you asked the average person what happened after the tomb of Tutankhamun was opened, they'd probably say something like, "Didn't everyone die?" Which is impressive storytelling. Because no, they didn't. In fact, this is where the entire curse narrative starts to wobble a little. Or a lot, depending on how much you enjoy facts getting in the way of a good story. Let's start with the obvious one. Howard Carter. The man who literally broke into the tomb. The first person to look inside. The guy who spent years working in and around those chambers, handling artifacts, breathing the air, and generally doing everything a curse would presumably take very personally. He lived for more than a decade after the discovery. No sudden collapse. No mysterious illness linked to the tomb. Just a relatively normal life, followed by a death from natural causes. Not exactly the dramatic, swift wings of death the headlines were promising. And he wasn't alone. Many members of the excavation team, along with workers and officials who were directly involved, went on to live perfectly ordinary lives. Some of them even had long careers afterward, continuing their work without any sign that they had been marked by an ancient supernatural force. Which raises a slightly awkward question for the curse theory. Why did it miss so many people? If this were truly a supernatural punishment for disturbing a pharaoh's tomb, you'd expect a bit more consistency, something reliable, a clear pattern. Instead, what we see is selective storytelling, a focus on a few unfortunate deaths, while quietly ignoring the much larger group of survivors. It's like watching a magician who only shows you the trick from one angle. Impressive, until you realise you're not seeing the full picture. But again, this doesn't make for a compelling headline. Most people totally fine after opening tomb is not exactly front-page material. It doesn't spark fear. It doesn't keep people talking. It doesn't sell. So the survivors were conveniently forgotten, or at least pushed into the background, where they wouldn't interfere with the narrative. Because once a story like the Curse of Tutankhamun takes hold, it doesn't need to be accurate. It just needs to be believable, and focusing on the few cases that support it, while ignoring the many that don't, makes it feel real enough, even if the reality is far less dramatic and far less cursed. At this point, the curse sounds convincing. A tomb is opened, a wealthy sponsor dies, a few other unfortunate events follow, and suddenly it feels like something larger is at play. But if you strip away the drama, there's one factor quietly sitting behind almost every case we've mentioned so far: luck. Or more accurately, bad luck. Because the early 20th century was not exactly a golden age for medical care. Infections that are easily treated today were back then genuinely dangerous. A small cut, a minor illness, even something as ordinary as a mosquito bite, the same one that took down Lord Carnarvon, could spiral into something far more serious. Antibiotics? Not widely available yet. Sterile procedures? Improving, but not perfect. So when something went wrong, it often went really wrong. And this matters, because when you look at the deaths connected to the tomb, many of them fall into that exact category. Infections, pre-existing conditions, or complications that, today, would likely be treated without much drama. In other words, these weren't mysterious, unexplainable deaths. They were the kind of deaths that were unfortunately common at the time. But when you place them next to something like the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb, they start to look different. Suddenly, a normal risk becomes part of a larger, more ominous pattern. And that's where luck comes in. Because not everyone exposed to the same environment gets sick. Not everyone bitten by a mosquito develops a fatal infection. Sometimes, it's just a combination of timing, health, and chance. One person walks away completely fine. Another doesn't. It's not satisfying. It's not dramatic. But it's how reality usually works. Of course, from the outside, randomness doesn't feel random. When something bad happens shortly after a major event, our brains immediately try to connect the two. We want a cause, a reason, something that makes sense of it all. Bad luck doesn't feel like enough. Ancient curse, on the other hand, feels very complete, very intentional, almost comforting in a strange way. At least there's a story behind it. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes there is no grand explanation. Sometimes people just get unlucky. And when you combine that bad luck with a harsh environment, limited medical knowledge, and a growing sense of fear, you get a series of events that look extraordinary, even if they're not. Which means the curse, once again, might not be a supernatural force at all, just a collection of very human outcomes, happening at exactly the wrong time. Now, before we completely dismiss the idea of a curse, it's only fair to admit something. The ancient Egyptians absolutely did try to protect their tombs, just not in the way the newspapers imagined. For them, death wasn't the end. It was a transition, and the tomb of Tutankhamun wasn't just a burial site. It was a carefully designed gateway to the afterlife. Every object, every symbol, every wall painting had a purpose. And protecting that space, that was taken very seriously. But instead of supernatural traps waiting to activate like a Hollywood script, their protection system was more psychological. They used spells, inscriptions, and religious warnings meant to discourage intruders. Messages that essentially said, if you mess with this, things will go very badly for you. Not because an invisible force would instantly strike you down, but because fear itself was a powerful deterrent. And honestly, it's not a bad strategy. If you're a potential tomb robber, already nervous about sneaking into a burial chamber filled with symbols of death, and you see a warning about divine punishment, you might reconsider your career choices, or at least take a moment to question your life decisions. The Egyptians understood something important. You don't always need physical barriers if you can get into someone's head. Of course, in the case of Howard Carter and his team, that approach didn't quite work. Either they didn't see such warnings, or they simply chose to ignore them, which, historically speaking, humans are very good at doing. But even if the curse wasn't literally written inside Tutankhamun's tomb, the broader cultural belief was very real. Disturbing the dead was seen as dangerous, disrespectful, and potentially catastrophic on a spiritual level. So when people in the 1920s started hearing about strange deaths connected to the tomb, their minds didn't have to stretch very far. The idea of a curse wasn't new. It had been part of the mythology all along. The difference was that now it felt like it was coming true, even if the actual cause was far less mystical. Because when you combine ancient beliefs, dramatic storytelling, and a few unfortunate coincidences, you end up with something that feels very convincing, even if it's not entirely accurate. And in a way, the Egyptians succeeded, not in stopping people from entering the tomb, but in ensuring that once they did, they'd never feel completely comfortable about it again, which, if you think about it, is a pretty effective form of protection, even 3,000 years later. By now the curse has taken centre stage, but if we step away from the drama for a moment, just briefly, I promise, the real danger of opening a tomb like that becomes a lot clearer. And honestly, it's not subtle. Because entering an ancient burial site isn't just about walking into a dusty room and admiring gold. It's more like stepping into a place where everything has been quietly waiting for thousands of years. And none of it was designed with your safety in mind. Take the structure itself. Tombs like the one of Tutankhamun were carved deep into rock, sealed, and left untouched. Over time, small shifts, cracks, and weakening can occur. Not enough to collapse immediately. That would be too convenient. But enough that disturbing the environment might trigger something. So when Howard Carter and his team started moving through the chambers, removing objects and altering the space, they weren't just exploring. They were changing the balance of a structure that had been stable for millennia. And that's just the walls. Then you have the contents, organic materials, ancient textiles, oils, resins, all preserved in a sealed environment. Once exposed to air, they begin to break down, releasing particles and gases we've already talked about. Not instantly lethal, but definitely not ideal if you enjoy breathing comfortably. Add to that the dust, layers of it fine and persistent. Every step sends it into the air. Every movement stirs it up. And over time, that exposure adds up. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself, but it's there. And let's not forget the simplest risk of all, human error. Working in confined, poorly lit spaces, surrounded by fragile artifacts and unstable surfaces, accidents are bound to happen. A slip, a fall, a misstep, all far more likely than being chased by an invisible curse. But here's the interesting part. None of these dangers make for a good story. Archaeologists face structural risks and environmental hazards doesn't exactly send chills down your spine. It doesn't make you question reality. It doesn't keep you up at night. So instead, all of that gets overshadowed by the idea of a curse, something mysterious, intentional, almost personal. When in reality, the tomb didn't need to be actively trying to harm anyone. It was already dangerous enough. Not because of ancient magic, but because of time, environment, and the simple fact that humans were never meant to casually walk into a place that had been sealed off for 3,000 years. And yet they did. Because of curiosity, because of ambition, and of course, because of gold, which, historically speaking, has convinced people to ignore far worse warnings than a few ancient symbols on a wall. By now, you can probably see what actually happened. A sealed tomb is opened. A few unfortunate deaths occur. Environmental hazards, infections, and bad luck do their thing. And yet, the story that survives is not about bacteria, air quality, or early 20th century medicine struggling to keep up. It's about a curse. And the real question is why? Why did that version of the story win? Because humans don't just like stories. We need them to make sense of things that feel random or uncomfortable. Saying a man died from an infected mosquito bite feels incomplete. It doesn't satisfy that part of your brain that's looking for meaning, for intention, for something bigger. But saying he was punished for disturbing the tomb of Tutankhamun, now that feels like a complete story. There's a cause. There's an effect. There's even a moral lesson. Don't disturb the dead. Clean. Simple. Slightly terrifying. And once a story like that takes hold, it becomes incredibly hard to replace. Even when better explanations exist, they're usually more complicated, less dramatic, and, let's be honest, a bit boring in comparison. Ancient spores and poor medical treatment doesn't exactly compete with vengeful pharaoh strikes again. Add to that the role of the media, which we've already seen, was more than happy to push the curse narrative, and you get something that spreads fast. Books, newspapers, later films and documentaries, all repeating the same idea, reinforcing it over and over again. And eventually it stops being a theory. It becomes part of culture. Even today, if you mention the discovery of the tomb to someone, there's a good chance they'll bring up the curse. Not the bacteria, not the environmental risks. The curse, because it's memorable, it's emotional, and it taps into something very old. The idea that there are forces we don't understand, watching, waiting, ready to respond when certain lines are crossed. Which, ironically, is exactly what the ancient Egyptians believed too, just not in the way we turned it into a headline. So in a strange way, the myth survived because it worked. It told a story people wanted to hear. It gave meaning to coincidence. It turned a series of unrelated events into a narrative that felt intentional, even if it wasn't. And once a story like that settles into the collective imagination, it doesn't really go away. It just waits, kind of like the tomb did. Only this time, instead of being sealed in stone, it's sealed in memory, passed down, retold, and reshaped with every generation, which might be the most powerful kind of curse there is. So after all the stories, the rumours, the headlines, and the very confident claims of ancient revenge, what actually killed the people who opened the tomb of Tutankhamun? The honest answer is far less dramatic, and somehow more unsettling. It wasn't one thing, it was a combination. A sealed environment filled with ancient dust, bacteria, and possibly toxic gases. A time when medicine was still catching up to infections that today feel almost trivial. A handful of unfortunate coincidences, timed just well enough to look suspicious. And on top of all that, fear, quietly amplifying everything in the background. No glowing curse. No invisible force picking off victims one by one. Just reality doing what it usually does. Messy, unpredictable, and not particularly interested in telling a clean story. And yet, the curse feels real, because when you line everything up, the opening of the tomb, the death of Lord Carnarvon, the strange timing, the media frenzy. It looks like a pattern. It feels like cause and effect, like something is connecting the dots behind the scenes. But sometimes the dots just happen to line up. And that's the part people struggle with, because randomness is uncomfortable. It doesn't give you a warning. It doesn't give you a lesson. It doesn't tell you what to avoid next time. It just happens. A curse, on the other hand, feels controlled, predictable, almost logical. Disturb the dead and something bad happens. Simple, but history rarely works that way. In reality, Howard Carter, the man most responsible for opening the tomb, lived on for years. Many others did too. The curse wasn't consistent. It didn't follow rules. It didn't behave like anything other than a story built around a few tragic events. And yet, here we are, still talking about it. Because in the end, the real mystery isn't what killed those people. It's why we're so drawn to the idea that something had to. Maybe it's curiosity. Maybe it's fear. Or maybe it's just the simple fact that a quiet explanation involving mold, air quality, and bad luck doesn't quite hit the same as the idea of an ancient king refusing to be disturbed. And if you're being honest, if you were standing in front of that sealed tomb, knowing everything we've just talked about, would you open it? Of course you would, because humans have always been like that, curious enough to ignore the warning, and confident enough to believe it won't happen to them, which, historically speaking, is usually when it does. And that wraps up tonight's journey into one of history's most famous curses. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoyed it. No ancient consequences involved. And let me know in the comments. Would you have opened the tomb? Just maybe bring a mask next time. Leonardo da Vinci wasn't just unusual. He seemed almost determined to live differently from everyone around him. In a world where people rose with the sun, worked through the day, and collapsed into long, uninterrupted sleep at night, Leonardo looked at that routine and quietly rejected it. To him, sleep wasn't rest. It was lost time. He's often said to have followed what we would now call a polyphasic sleep cycle. Instead of sleeping for 7 or 8 hours like a normal person trying to function in Renaissance Italy, Leonardo allegedly slept in short bursts, 15 to 20 minutes at a time, spread across the entire day. Imagine trying to explain that to your neighbours while they're lighting candles for bed, and you're setting an alarm to wake up in 20 minutes and go sketch a flying machine. The reasoning behind this strange habit was brutally practical. Leonardo believed that by reducing long sleep, he could reclaim hours of consciousness, hours he could spend observing, experimenting, drawing, dissecting, or inventing something no one had ever seen before. And for a man whose mind seemed to generate ideas faster than ink could capture them, time was the only real limitation. Of course, this raises a very obvious question. Did it actually work? Modern science would probably say absolutely not. Most people attempting this today would quickly become exhausted, confused, and possibly start questioning their life choices around day 3. But Leonardo wasn't most people. His notebooks suggest a mind that rarely slowed down, as if his thoughts refused to obey the same biological rules as everyone else's. There's also the possibility that this habit has been slightly exaggerated over time. After all, history has a tendency to take a strange detail and polish it into legend. But even if the exact schedule isn't perfectly accurate, it reflects something very real about Leonardo's personality. His refusal to accept limits simply because others did. While everyone else surrendered to sleep, Leonardo treated it like a minor inconvenience. And in doing so, he revealed a pattern that would define much of his life. If something seemed inefficient, he would question it. If something seemed fixed, he would experiment with it. Even something as basic as sleep was not safe from his curiosity. And that was only the beginning of his strange habits. If refusing to sleep like a normal person wasn't strange enough, Leonardo da Vinci also decided that writing in a perfectly readable direction was, apparently, optional. Instead, he filled thousands of pages with mirror writing, text written from right to left, readable only when reflected in a mirror. At first glance, it looks like something out of a codebreaker's nightmare. Entire notebooks filled with reversed letters, diagrams labelled in backward script, thoughts flowing in a direction that feels almost unnatural to the eye. If you stumbled across one of his journals without context, You might assume you'd found the ramblings of someone deliberately trying to confuse the world. So why did he do it? One common explanation is secrecy. Leonardo was working on ideas that were far ahead of his time. Anatomical studies, engineering designs, even early concepts of flight and weaponry. Writing backwards could have been his way of protecting his work from prying eyes. After all, not everyone walking into his workshop would carry a mirror just to snoop through his notes. But there's a simpler, almost annoyingly practical explanation. Leonardo was left-handed. In a time when ink smudged easily and paper was expensive, writing from left to right could drag his hand across fresh ink, turning careful notes into a smeared disaster. Writing backwards solved that problem instantly. No smudging, no ruined sketches, just clean, precise lines. Still, practicality alone doesn't fully explain the consistency of it. Leonardo didn't just occasionally use mirror writing, he embraced it. It became his default mode, as natural to him as normal writing is to us. That suggests something deeper than convenience. It hints at a mind that simply enjoyed approaching things from the opposite direction, quite literally. There's also something revealing in the way his thoughts flow across those reversed pages. They aren't chaotic. They're structured, deliberate, almost obsessive in their organization. This wasn't a gimmick. It was a system, one that allowed him to think, record, and refine ideas in a way that felt uniquely his. In a world where most people followed tradition without question, Leonardo rewrote the rules, sometimes backwards, just to prove he could. If Leonardo da Vinci had one habit that bordered on obsession, it was this. He wrote everything down. And not just occasionally, constantly. He carried small notebooks with him wherever he went, treating the world like an endless source of problems to solve and details to capture. Walking through the streets of Florence or Milan with Leonardo would have been slow. Not because he was lazy, but because he simply couldn't stop observing. A strange facial expression. Into the notebook. The way light hit a wall at sunset. Into the notebook. The structure of a bird's wing mid-flight. Definitely into the notebook, probably with 3 diagrams, and a question about how to replicate it mechanically. His notes weren't just random scribbles either. They were a chaotic mix of art, science, engineering, and curiosity, all crammed into the same pages. One moment he'd be sketching a human skull with unsettling precision, and the next he'd be designing a flying machine that looked like something pulled from the future. To Leonardo, there was no boundary between disciplines. Everything connected, so everything belonged in the same notebook. What makes this habit even stranger is how unfinished many of his ideas were. Leonardo didn't wait for a thought to become polished or complete. He captured it in its raw form. Half-formed questions, sudden observations, fragments of theories. It's as if he understood that ideas are fragile, and if you don't catch them immediately, they disappear. Some of his notes even read like personal reminders, almost impatient in tone. Short commands to himself. Describe the tongue of the woodpecker. Observe the movement of water. Find a way to measure the depth of a river. It's less like reading a journal and more like peeking into a mind that refuses to be idle. And then there's the volume. Thousands of pages survive today, and that's likely only a fraction of what he actually wrote. Imagine the discipline, or perhaps the restlessness, it takes to document your thoughts at that scale, without ever deciding, that's enough for today. While most people experience the world and move on, Leonardo documented it, dissected it, and stored it for later use. His notebooks weren't just records, they were extensions of his mind. And in a way, they reveal his strangest habit of all. He didn't just live in the world. He studied it relentlessly, as if he were afraid it might stop making sense if he ever stopped paying attention. In Renaissance Italy, being a vegetarian wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was almost unheard of. Meat was a symbol of wealth, strength, and status. If you could afford it, you ate it. If you couldn't, you wished you could. And yet, Leonardo da Vinci looked at all of that and quietly decided he wanted no part of it. He is often described as someone who avoided eating meat, not because of scarcity, but because of principle. According to several accounts, Leonardo had a deep discomfort with the idea of killing animals for food. He reportedly believed that animals felt pain and fear just as humans did, a view that, at the time, was far from mainstream. There are even stories, some possibly exaggerated but still revealing, of Leonardo buying caged birds in marketplaces, only to release them back into the sky, not for spectacle, not for praise, just because he didn't like seeing them confined. Imagine being a merchant trying to sell birds for a living and repeatedly encountering the same man who keeps undoing your entire business model out of pure empathy. What makes this habit particularly striking is the contrast with his other work. Leonardo dissected human corpses to study anatomy, carefully examining muscles, organs and bones with almost surgical precision. He wasn't squeamish, he wasn't avoiding death, and yet, when it came to animals, he showed a level of compassion that feels surprisingly modern. This contradiction reveals something important about his mindset. Leonardo didn't simply follow emotional impulses, he questioned them. He explored life and death from multiple angles, trying to understand both the mechanics of the body and the value of living creatures. To him, knowledge and empathy weren't opposites, they coexisted. Of course, it's difficult to say how strictly he followed this diet at all times. Renaissance records aren't exactly detailed grocery logs. But the consistency of these accounts suggests that this wasn't a passing preference. It was part of his identity. While others saw animals as resources, Leonardo saw them as beings worthy of consideration. And in a time when such an idea was rare, if not outright strange, it made him stand out even more. Because for Leonardo, curiosity wasn't just about understanding the world. It was also about deciding how to exist within it. For someone widely considered one of the greatest minds in history, Leonardo da Vinci had a surprisingly frustrating habit. He almost never finished what he started. At first, this sounds like an exaggeration. Surely a man responsible for masterpieces like the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper must have been incredibly disciplined, right? Well, not exactly. Leonardo had a tendency to begin ambitious projects with intense enthusiasm, only to abandon them halfway through when something new caught his attention. His notebooks are filled with plans, grand machines, architectural designs, scientific experiments that were never completed. Some were barely started. Others exist only as sketches and scattered notes, like ideas frozen mid-thought. It's as if his brain moved faster than reality could keep up with. Even his most famous works suffered from this habit. The Mona Lisa, for example, wasn't painted in a straightforward, focused burst of effort. Leonardo carried it with him for years, continuously refining it, adjusting tiny details, never quite declaring it finished. For him, completion seemed almost optional. Then there's The Last Supper, a masterpiece that was already deteriorating within decades of its completion. Why? Because Leonardo decided to experiment with a new painting technique instead of using the reliable methods of the time. The result looked incredible, but it didn't last. A perfect example of his mindset. Innovation over practicality, even if it meant long-term consequences. So why did he struggle to finish things? Part of the answer lies in his endless curiosity. Leonardo wasn't just a painter. He was an engineer, anatomist, inventor, and observer of everything. The moment a new question appeared in his mind, it demanded attention. And compared to the excitement of a new idea, finishing an old project probably felt boring. There's also a deeper possibility. Leonardo may have been less interested in results and more obsessed with the process itself. The act of exploring, experimenting, and discovering was what drove him, not necessarily the final product. In that sense, stopping halfway wasn't failure. It was simply moving on to the next question. To the people around him, this habit must have been maddening. Imagine commissioning a project and watching the artist disappear into a completely unrelated experiment about water flow or bird wings. But from Leonardo's perspective, everything was connected. Every unfinished painting, every abandoned design, it all fed into something larger. Still, it leaves us with a strange truth. One of history's greatest geniuses was also one of its most relentless procrastinators. If Leonardo da Vinci's daytime habits were unusual, his nighttime activities were something else entirely. While most of Renaissance society avoided anything remotely connected to death, Leonardo actively sought it out, quietly, methodically, and often under the cover of darkness. He conducted dissections of human bodies, not once or twice out of curiosity, but repeatedly, over years. It's estimated that he dissected dozens of corpses, carefully examining muscles, tendons, organs, and bones, with a level of detail that was unheard of at the time. And he didn't just look, he documented everything. His anatomical drawings are still considered astonishing today. The precision, the layering, the understanding of how the human body actually functions. It feels modern, almost surgical. But in his time, this kind of work was controversial, even disturbing. Religious and social norms placed heavy restrictions on handling the dead, and the idea of cutting open a human body was, for many, deeply unsettling. So Leonardo worked quietly, often at night. Imagine dim candlelight, the silence of a room far removed from the noise of the city, and Leonardo leaning over a body, sketching, observing, asking questions no one else seemed willing to ask. What makes this habit even more intense is the way he approached it. He didn't treat these dissections as morbid curiosities. He treated them as puzzles. How does the heart actually pump blood? How do muscles create movement? What happens inside the body when it ages? In one case, he dissected the body of an elderly man shortly after his death, trying to understand what caused him to die peacefully. In another, he studied the development of a fetus, producing drawings that would remain unmatched for centuries. These weren't surface-level observations. They were deep, relentless investigations into life itself. And yet there's a strange contrast here. The same man who showed compassion toward animals, refusing to eat them, releasing birds from cages, was also cutting into human bodies with clinical precision. It seems contradictory, but for Leonardo, it wasn't. He wasn't driven by cruelty. He was driven by understanding. To him, the human body wasn't sacred in the way society saw it. It was a system, a complex, beautiful machine that needed to be studied, taken apart, and understood piece by piece. While others feared death, Leonardo leaned into it, not out of darkness, but out of curiosity. Because if you want to understand life, he seemed to believe, you have to be willing to examine what lies beneath it. Leonardo da Vinci had a habit that sounds harmless at first, but quickly becomes exhausting the more you think about it. He questioned everything, constantly, relentlessly, to a level that most people simply wouldn't tolerate in everyday life. His notebooks are filled with questions, hundreds of them, scattered between sketches and diagrams like a mind that refuses to sit still. But these weren't simple questions. They were the kind that force you to stop, stare, and realize you've never actually thought about something as basic as why the sky is blue. He would ask things like, why is the sky blue? How do birds stay in the air? What causes water to move the way it does? How does the human eye truly see? And then, instead of accepting the common explanations of his time, which were often based on tradition rather than evidence, he would go out and test them himself. This wasn't curiosity in the casual sense. This was obsession. Most people, when faced with a mystery, either accept a convenient answer or move on. Leonardo did neither. If something didn't make complete sense, it bothered him. It stayed in his mind, unresolved, like an itch he couldn't ignore. And the only way to deal with it was to investigate, experiment and observe, until he reached something that felt like truth. What makes this habit particularly strange is how unnecessary it often seemed. He wasn't being paid to figure out why light reflects the way it does, or how water curls around obstacles. There was no immediate reward, no deadline forcing him forward. He simply couldn't tolerate not knowing. This constant questioning shaped everything he did. It's why his art feels so alive, because he didn't just paint what things looked like. He studied how they worked. It's why his inventions feel ahead of their time. Because he wasn't copying existing designs, he was trying to understand the principles behind them. But there's a downside to this kind of thinking. When you question everything, nothing is ever truly finished. There's always another layer to explore, another angle to consider, another why waiting behind the last one. For Leonardo, certainty was never the goal. Exploration was, and while the rest of the world was content with answers, Leonardo remained stuck, by choice, in a permanent state of curiosity, always asking one more question than anyone else thought necessary. Leonardo da Vinci had a habit that, at the time, must have seemed borderline absurd. He spent enormous amounts of time designing machines that no one had ever seen, and in many cases couldn't even build. While others focused on practical inventions that solved immediate problems, Leonardo's mind wandered far beyond the limits of his era. He sketched flying machines inspired by birds, armoured vehicles that resemble early tanks, diving suits for underwater exploration, and complex mechanical devices that looked more like ideas from centuries in the future than anything rooted in the 15th century. The strange part wasn't just the ideas themselves, it was how seriously he pursued them. These weren't quick doodles or passing fantasies. His designs were detailed, measured, and thought through with surprising precision. Gears, pulleys, wings, joints. Everything was carefully considered, as if he fully expected someone to eventually bring these concepts to life. And yet most of them were never built. Part of the reason was technological limitation. Renaissance materials and engineering simply weren't advanced enough to support some of his visions. A flying machine, for example, requires a level of understanding and material strength that didn't exist at the time. Leonardo could imagine it, sketch it, and even theorize how it might work. But actually making it happen was another matter entirely. Still, that didn't stop him. What makes this habit so unusual is that Leonardo wasn't discouraged by the gap between imagination and reality. Most people, when faced with an idea they can't physically achieve, abandon it. Leonardo did the opposite. He explored it even further, refining it, adjusting it, almost as if the act of thinking it through was valuable in itself. There's also a deeper pattern here. His designs often came from observing nature. Birds in flight, the flow of water, the structure of muscles. He wasn't inventing randomly. He was translating the natural world into mechanical form. In his mind, if something existed in nature, it could be understood. And if it could be understood, it could eventually be recreated. To the people around him, this must have seemed impractical, maybe even pointless. Why spend years designing machines that can't be built? But Leonardo wasn't working for his present. He was thinking ahead, far ahead. And in doing so, he revealed something that made him truly strange. He wasn't limited by the world he lived in. He was already imagining the one that hadn't arrived yet. If you tried to define Leonardo da Vinci in a single word, you would fail almost immediately. Painter feels too narrow, inventor too technical, scientist too modern. The truth is, Leonardo had one final habit that tied all the others together. He refused to stay the same person for long. Most people build an identity and settle into it. A painter paints, a sculptor sculpts, a scholar studies. Leonardo did all of these, and then moved on, often before mastering one field in the traditional sense. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't see the point of limiting himself to a single path. At different moments in his life, he was deeply immersed in art, then suddenly absorbed in anatomy, then lost in engineering, then obsessed with water, light, or flight. It wasn't a career. It was a continuous transformation, one curiosity leading to another, pulling him in directions that probably confused everyone around him. This constant shifting made him difficult to understand, and even harder to manage. Patrons who hired him for paintings found themselves waiting while he disappeared into studies of geometry or experiments with optics. He wasn't unreliable in the usual sense. He was simply following a different internal logic, one that prioritized discovery over obligation. What's strange is that he didn't seem bothered by this lack of a fixed identity. In fact, it may have been the very thing that defined him. Leonardo didn't want to be known for one achievement. He wanted to understand everything, even if that meant never fully belonging to any single discipline. There's also something quietly unsettling about this. A man who is always changing is a man who is never finished. While others built legacies that could be easily summarized, Leonardo left behind fragments, masterpieces, sketches, notes, inventions, questions, all pointing in different directions. And yet, that's exactly what makes him unforgettable, because Leonardo da Vinci wasn't trying to arrive at a final version of himself. He was always in motion, always evolving, always chasing the next idea that caught his attention. While the rest of the world searched for certainty, Leonardo embraced uncertainty. And in doing so, he became something far more unusual than a genius. He became a mind that never stopped becoming. The story of Vercingetorix doesn't end with defeat. It begins with one of the most calculated surrenders in ancient history. After months of brutal fighting, starvation, and psychological warfare during the siege of Alesia, the Gallic resistance had reached its breaking point. Surrounded by Roman fortifications on both sides, with no escape and no food left, the outcome was no longer a question. But what happened next wasn't chaos, it was control. According to the accounts of Julius Caesar, Vercingetorix chose to end it himself, not with a desperate final charge, not by hiding, and not by being dragged out in chains. Instead, he mounted his horse, put on his finest armour, and rode out of Alesia alone to face the man who had defeated him. Picture the scene, Roman soldiers watching in silence. A man who had united much of Gaul, something few had ever achieved, now riding directly into the enemy camp. Not as a prisoner, not yet, but as a leader making a final decision. He approached Caesar, circled him slowly, almost deliberately, as if marking the moment. Then he dismounted, removed his weapons, and placed them at Caesar's feet. No speech, no dramatic plea, just a silent act that said everything. This wasn't surrender out of weakness. It was strategy. Vercingetorix likely understood something crucial. If he continued resisting, more of his people would die. But if he surrendered himself, he might preserve what remained of them. In that moment, he stopped being just a war leader and became something else. A man choosing sacrifice over pride. Of course, there's another layer here. The version we have comes largely from Caesar himself, and Caesar was not exactly known for writing neutral reports. The image of a proud enemy submitting gracefully? It made for excellent propaganda. It turned a military victory into a symbolic one. Still, even if the details were polished, the core truth remains. Vercingetorix did not vanish in battle. He stepped forward and gave himself up. And that decision, quiet, controlled, and final, would lead him not to death immediately, but to something far more uncertain. Because Rome didn't always kill its enemies right away. Sometimes it kept them alive. What happens after a man like Vercingetorix surrenders? You might expect an immediate execution, quick, decisive, and brutally Roman. But Rome had a different plan, a slower one, a more calculated one. Instead of killing him after the siege of Alesia, Julius Caesar chose to keep him alive, not out of mercy, not out of respect, but because Vercingetorix had become something far more valuable than a corpse. He was now a symbol. After his surrender, he was taken into Roman custody and began the long journey south toward Rome. This wasn't a dignified transfer. He was no longer a king, no longer a commander, but a captive, bound, watched, and completely at the mercy of the empire he had tried to resist. The journey itself would have been a slow, humiliating process, moving across lands that had once been contested, through territories now firmly under Roman control. Vercingetorix would have seen the result of his defeat unfolding in real time. Roman authority expanding, resistance fading, the world he had tried to unite slipping away piece by piece. And yet, he wasn't treated like an ordinary prisoner. Rome had a habit of preserving important enemies for a specific purpose. They didn't just want to win. They wanted to display their victory. A defeated leader like Vercingetorix was far more useful alive, especially if he could be shown to the Roman people at the right moment. That moment, however, wasn't immediate. Instead of being brought straight into the public eye, he was kept hidden, removed from the chaos of war and placed into a controlled environment where he could be stored. Yes, stored, until Caesar decided the time was right. And this is where the story becomes more unsettling, because Vercingetorix didn't spend a few weeks or months waiting for his fate. He spent years in captivity, cut off from his people, his power, and any real sense of control over his future. The man who had once commanded armies was now reduced to waiting for a decision that wasn't his to make, waiting for a moment he couldn't predict, and perhaps worst of all, waiting without knowing exactly how it would all end. Because in Rome, victory wasn't just about defeating your enemy. It was about deciding when and how their story would finally be finished. If the journey to Rome stripped Vercingetorix of his power, what came next stripped him of everything else. Once he arrived in the city, he wasn't placed in some guarded villa or kept under comfortable house arrest. Rome reserved something far more fitting for enemies of his status. He was taken to the Tullianum, a dark underground prison at the heart of the city, a place less designed for living and more for waiting to die. The Tullianum wasn't a prison in the modern sense. There were no cells with windows, no routines, no sense of time passing. It was a damp, enclosed chamber carved below ground level, where light barely reached and air barely moved. Prisoners weren't sent there to be rehabilitated or even properly detained. They were sent there to disappear until Rome decided it was time to remember them again. And that's exactly what happened to Vercingetorix. For years, likely around 6, he remained in that darkness. No battles, no speeches, no command, just silence, broken only by the occasional presence of guards who had no reason to speak to him. Imagine the shift. A man who once coordinated entire armies, now measuring time not in days or campaigns but in moments of isolation. What makes this even more unsettling is the lack of detailed records. Rome, for all its documentation, doesn't tell us much about what his daily life looked like. No descriptions of his condition, no insight into his thoughts. Just the bare fact that he was there. And that absence speaks volumes. It suggests that, to Rome, his life during those years didn't matter. He wasn't a person anymore. He was an object being preserved for a future event, a living trophy, stored in darkness until the right moment. There's also something psychological about this kind of captivity. Execution is immediate. Exile offers distance. But prolonged imprisonment? That creates a different kind of suffering. One where uncertainty becomes constant. Where every passing day brings you no closer to freedom, only closer to an unknown end. Vercingetorix had fought Rome in open battle and lost. But here, beneath the city, there was nothing left to fight. No enemies to face, no decisions to make. Just waiting in the dark, as the empire above him prepared to use his final moment for something much bigger than himself. Time passed, and with it, something even more brutal than defeat settled in. Irrelevance. After the initial spectacle of capturing Vercingetorix faded, Rome simply moved on. Above the darkness of the Tullianum, life in the city continued as if nothing had happened. Political rivalries shifted, new campaigns were launched, victories were won and lost. And at the centre of it all, Julius Caesar continued building his power, step by calculated step. Meanwhile, the man who had once stood as Rome's greatest enemy sat beneath it, completely removed from the flow of history. This is the part of Vercingetorix's story that feels the most unsettling. Not because of violence, but because of absence. There are no dramatic events, no recorded speeches, no last stands, just years of silence. A slow fading from relevance, while the world above him reshaped itself without his presence, and that may have been intentional. Rome understood something about power that many others didn't. Defeating an enemy on the battlefield was one thing, but erasing them from memory was another. By keeping Vercingetorix hidden, out of sight and out of conversation, Rome effectively removed him from the narrative of resistance. He wasn't being celebrated as a martyr. He wasn't rallying support. He was simply gone. But this wasn't mercy. It was timing, because while Rome forgot him publicly, it never truly discarded him. His existence still had a purpose, even if it was postponed. He was being held for a moment that hadn't arrived yet, a moment when his presence would mean something again, not as a leader, but as a symbol. Imagine what that must have felt like, to go from commanding tens of thousands to being completely irrelevant, to know that your fate wasn't even urgent enough to resolve, that you were important enough to keep alive, but not important enough to be remembered in the meantime. There's a kind of psychological weight in that, and yet above him, something was building. Because Julius Caesar wasn't done, his victories in Gaul, including the defeat of Vercingetorix, were part of a much larger story, one that would eventually bring him back to Rome in triumph. And when that moment finally came, Rome would remember the man it had buried in darkness, not to honour him, but to finish what it had started. For years, Vercingetorix had been nothing more than a forgotten prisoner beneath Rome, but above him something had been building, slowly, carefully, and with purpose. Julius Caesar was preparing for one of the most important moments of his career, his triumph. A Roman triumph wasn't just a parade, it was a carefully staged performance, designed to show the people of Rome exactly how powerful their generals were. It needed spectacle, it needed drama, and most importantly, it needed a defeated enemy. That's where Vercingetorix came back into the story. After years in the Tullianum, he was brought out, not as a man reclaiming his place in history, but as a prop in someone else's victory. His entire existence during those lost years had been leading to this moment. Picture the streets of Rome filled with crowds, citizens gathering to witness Caesar's success, soldiers marching in formation, spoils of war carried through the city, gold, weapons, treasures taken from conquered lands, everything designed to overwhelm, to impress, to remind Rome of its dominance. And then, somewhere in that procession, came Vercingetorix, not on horseback, not in armour, but in chains. The contrast would have been deliberate. Once a powerful leader who united tribes and challenged Rome itself, now reduced to a captive being paraded before the very people he had fought against. His presence wasn't just symbolic, it was essential. Without him, the victory would feel incomplete, because Rome didn't just want to show that it had won, it wanted to show who had lost. There's something calculated, almost theatrical about this. Vercingetorix wasn't executed immediately after his capture, because his death alone wasn't enough. Rome needed him alive long enough to be displayed, to be seen, to serve as living proof of Caesar's success. And Caesar understood this perfectly. The triumph wasn't just about celebrating military achievement. It was about shaping perception. It was about turning a complex war into a simple story. Rome victorious, its enemies broken and humbled. For the crowd, this was entertainment, a spectacle, a moment of pride. But for Vercingetorix, it was the final transformation, from leader to prisoner to symbol. And once that symbol had been fully displayed, there was only one step left. Because in Rome, the end of a triumph was never just a celebration. It was also an execution. After years of silence beneath the Tullianum, Vercingetorix was brought back into the light, but not as the man he once was. The day of Julius Caesar's triumph had arrived. Rome was alive with anticipation. Streets packed with citizens, balconies filled with onlookers, the entire city transformed into a stage. And at the centre of it all was a procession designed to tell a story, one where Caesar was the hero. But every hero needs a defeated enemy. Vercingetorix was that enemy. He was led through the streets in chains, displayed to the crowd as part of the spectacle. This wasn't a quiet march. It was deliberate, slow, and highly visible. Every step was meant to be seen, every moment carefully staged to reinforce the message. Rome had crushed its greatest challenger in Gaul. Imagine the contrast. Just a few years earlier, this same man had commanded armies, united tribes, and forced Rome into one of its most difficult campaigns. Now, he walked as a prisoner, surrounded by Roman soldiers, unable to speak, unable to resist, reduced to a visual symbol of defeat. The crowd likely reacted with a mix of awe and indifference. Some would have recognized his significance, the leader who dared oppose Rome. Others would have seen him as just another conquered enemy, one more face in a long line of victories. That's the strange part about Roman triumphs. They turned real people into props. Vercingetorix wasn't there to tell his story. He wasn't there to explain his decisions or defend his actions. He was there to be seen and nothing more. There's also something deeply calculated in the timing. After years of imprisonment, bringing him out at this exact moment maximised the impact. He had been removed from memory just long enough to be reintroduced as a symbol, rather than a threat. The man who once inspired resistance was now presented as proof that resistance was pointless. And yet, despite everything, the chains, the humiliation, the loss of power, there's a quiet intensity in imagining that walk. Because this wasn't a random captive. This was Vercingetorix, a man who had faced Rome at its strongest and forced it to fight harder than it expected. And now, as he moved through the streets, surrounded by the empire that had defeated him, his story was reaching its final moment. Because in Rome, the parade was never the end. It was the beginning of the last act. At the end of the triumph, when the crowds began to disperse and the celebration faded, Vercingetorix was not taken to a public square or given a final speech. There was no dramatic farewell, no last stand. Rome didn't need spectacle anymore. It needed closure. After being paraded through the city, he was led back to the place where his final years had been spent, the Tullianum. The same underground chamber that had held him in silence was now waiting to end his life. This is where Rome finished what it had started. Executions in the Tullianum were not designed to be seen. They were quiet, controlled, and efficient. The method most commonly used for high-profile prisoners was strangulation, deliberate, personal, and final. No crowd, no applause. Just a small group of officials carrying out the last step in a carefully planned process. And so, after years of waiting, Vercingetorix's life ended not in battle, but in darkness. There's something deeply unsettling about that contrast. A man who once stood at the centre of a massive resistance, who led armies and faced one of Rome's greatest generals, was ultimately reduced to a silent execution beneath the city that defeated him. No audience to witness his final moment. No opportunity to shape how he would be remembered. But from Rome's perspective, that was the point. The triumph had already shown the world what needed to be seen. The message had been delivered. Rome wins. Its enemies lose. What happened after that didn't need to be public. In fact, making it private removed any risk of turning Vercingetorix into something more. No martyr. No final words that could inspire others. It was a controlled ending to a carefully controlled narrative. And yet, despite the silence surrounding his death, the weight of it remains. Because execution doesn't erase what came before. It doesn't undo the fact that he had united tribes that rarely worked together, or that he had pushed Rome into a difficult and costly campaign. Rome may have ended his life quietly, but it couldn't completely erase his impact. In the end, Vercingetorix didn't die as a forgotten man. He died as someone Rome had to carefully manage, from his surrender to his imprisonment to his final breath, because even in defeat, he was too significant to simply disappear. With the death of Vercingetorix, Rome had technically finished the story. The enemy was defeated, displayed, and eliminated. From a Roman perspective, everything had gone exactly as planned. But ending a life is one thing. Controlling a memory is another. Rome didn't just conquer lands, it shaped narratives. And in the case of Vercingetorix, the narrative was carefully written by the very man who defeated him, Julius Caesar. His accounts of the Gallic Wars became the dominant version of events, presenting Rome as disciplined, strategic, and ultimately unstoppable, while framing its enemies as brave, but flawed, divided, and destined to lose. In that version of history, Vercingetorix appears, but only in a controlled way. He's acknowledged as a capable leader, even respected at times, but always positioned as the one who failed, the man who challenged Rome and lost. This wasn't accidental. By shaping the story, Rome ensured that resistance looked admirable, but ultimately pointless. It allowed them to celebrate their enemies just enough to make their own victory seem greater, while still reinforcing the idea that opposing Rome was a losing effort. And for a while it worked. After his death, Vercingetorix didn't immediately become a legendary hero. He faded into the background, mentioned in texts but not widely celebrated. His story existed, but it wasn't dominant. It didn't inspire movements or reshape identities, at least not right away. That's the strange part about historical memory. It isn't fixed. It shifts over time, depending on who tells the story and why. Centuries later, Vercingetorix would be remembered very differently, not as a defeated rebel, but as a symbol of unity, resistance, and identity, especially in France, where he would eventually be seen as a national hero. But Rome couldn't have predicted that. From their perspective, they had controlled everything. The victory, the spectacle, the ending, and even the story itself. They had taken a man who once united tribes against them and turned him into a supporting character in their own narrative. And for a long time that version held. But memory has a way of slipping out of control, because even the most carefully managed story can be rewritten, especially when the figure at its centre refuses to be forgotten entirely. At the moment of his death, Vercingetorix was exactly what Rome wanted him to be, a defeated enemy, reduced to a symbol of Caesar's success. His story had been controlled, his image reshaped, his end carefully managed, and for a time that version of him held. But history has a strange habit of changing its mind. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, and Rome itself faded into memory. And somewhere along the way, the story of Vercingetorix began to shift. No longer seen only through the lens of Julius Caesar's writings, he started to re-emerge as something else entirely. Not a failure, but a figure of resistance. In later French history, Especially during the 19th century, Vercingetorix was rediscovered and reimagined. He became a symbol of unity. The man who, against all odds, brought together tribes that had long been divided. The fact that he lost didn't erase that achievement. If anything, it made it more powerful. He had stood against one of the greatest forces of the ancient world and forced it to fight harder than expected. That alone was enough to reshape how he was remembered. Monuments were built, stories were retold. His image transformed from a chained prisoner in a Roman triumph to a proud warrior standing against foreign domination. The same man, two completely different meanings, depending on who was telling the story. And that's where the real ending lies. Because Vercingetorix's life didn't conclude in the darkness of the Tullianum. It continued in memory, in interpretation, in the way people chose to understand his actions long after Rome was gone. Rome tried to define him as a warning. History turned him into a symbol. There's something almost ironic about that. The empire that controlled his fate so carefully couldn't control how he would be remembered forever. The narrative they built eventually slipped, shifted, and evolved into something they never intended. And maybe that's the most important part of his story. Because in the end, Vercingetorix didn't win the war, but he outlasted the version of himself that Rome created. And sometimes, that's the only victory that matters. In medieval Europe, becoming an artist wasn't about talent, it was about permission. And that permission came from one place: the guild. Guilds were powerful organizations that controlled almost every aspect of artistic life. If you wanted to paint, sculpt, or even mix pigments professionally, you didn't just pick up a brush and start working. You had to be accepted into a guild, trained under its rules and approved by its masters. Without that, you weren't an artist. You were just someone with suspicious amounts of paint, and getting in wasn't easy. Most artists began as apprentices, often as children, sometimes as young as 12. They would leave their families and move into the home of a master artist, where they lived, worked, and learned for years. This wasn't a casual internship. It was full control. The master dictated your schedule, your training, and in many cases your daily life. You didn't start by painting masterpieces. You started by grinding pigments, cleaning brushes, preparing wooden panels, and doing whatever repetitive task the workshop required. Imagine spending years just learning how to properly mix colours while watching someone else take all the credit for the final painting. Because that was another rule. You didn't own your work. Anything you created as an apprentice belonged to your master. Your ideas, your sketches, even your small contributions to larger works were absorbed into the workshop. Your name didn't go on anything. You were invisible. And even after years of training, you weren't free yet. To move up, you had to become a journeyman, travelling from workshop to workshop, proving your skills. Only after that could you attempt to become a master, and that required producing a masterpiece, a work so perfect that the guild itself would approve it. And here's the strange part. Even that wasn't enough sometimes. Guilds could reject you for reasons that had nothing to do with skill. Politics, connections, or simply too many existing masters could block your progress. Talent alone didn't guarantee success. So before an artist could even think about creativity, they had to survive a system designed to control it. Because in medieval guilds, art wasn't just expression, it was regulation. In medieval Europe, becoming an artist wasn't a matter of talent, passion, or waking up one day and deciding to paint something meaningful. It was a controlled process, strict, regulated, and monitored by powerful organizations known as guilds. If you weren't part of a guild, you weren't recognized as an artist. You were just someone making things without permission. And permission was everything. Guilds controlled who could work, what they could produce, how much they could charge, and even how they trained. They existed to maintain standards, protect their members, and, more importantly, limit competition. Which meant becoming an artist wasn't about proving your creativity. It was about navigating a system designed to filter people out. Most began as apprentices, often at a very young age. Around 12 or 13, a boy would be sent to live with a master artist, sometimes in a completely different city. From that moment on, his life changed entirely. He didn't just learn from the master, he belonged to his household. He followed his rules, worked his hours, and adapted to a structure that left very little room for independence. And despite what you might imagine, he wasn't painting beautiful works right away. For years, the tasks were repetitive and, frankly, exhausting. Grinding minerals into fine powders to create pigments, preparing wooden panels with layers of gesso, cleaning tools, running errands, observing, always observing. Actual painting came much later, and even then it was usually small, controlled contributions to larger works, because nothing he created truly belonged to him. Every brushstroke, every detail, every piece of effort was considered part of the master's workshop. The final artwork carried the master's name, not the apprentice's. Individual identity wasn't the goal. Consistency and control were. Even after years of training, freedom didn't come easily. The apprentice would become a journeyman, travelling between workshops, continuing to refine his skills while still lacking full independence. And only after proving himself repeatedly could he attempt to become a master, by producing a masterpiece that met the guild's exacting standards. But even that wasn't a guarantee. Guilds could reject candidates for reasons beyond skill. Limited space, internal politics, or simply the desire to keep numbers low could block advancement. Talent alone wasn't enough to succeed. So before an artist could ever express creativity, he had to survive a system built to control it. Because in medieval guilds, art wasn't just about creation. It was about permission. Once you finally earned your place inside a medieval guild, you might expect a sense of freedom. After all those years of training, discipline, and proving yourself, surely now you could paint what you wanted. Not even close. Guild artists didn't create freely. They followed instructions, strict ones. Most of their work came from commissions, often from the church or wealthy patrons. And those commissions came with very clear expectations. You weren't being paid to express yourself. You were being paid to deliver something specific, recognizable, and approved. If a church ordered a painting of a saint, it wasn't an open-ended interpretation. That saint had to look a certain way, wear specific clothing, hold particular symbols, and appear in a familiar pose. Deviate too much, and the work could be rejected, not because it was bad, but because it was wrong. Creativity in this system was tightly contained. Even the colours you used could be dictated. Certain pigments were expensive, reserved for important figures. Blue, for example, made from lapis lazuli, was often used for the Virgin Mary, not because the artist felt like it, but because tradition and expectation demanded it. Using the wrong colour in the wrong place wasn't just a stylistic mistake. It could be seen as disrespectful or unprofessional. And it didn't stop there. Guilds themselves enforced rules about quality and consistency. If your work didn't meet the expected standard, it could be inspected, criticised, or even destroyed. Imagine spending weeks on a piece, only for it to be rejected because it didn't align with established guidelines. There was also a strong emphasis on imitation. Artists were expected to learn from established models and repeat successful styles. Originality wasn't the priority. Reliability was. If a certain composition worked, you used it again, and again, and again. This created a strange environment where skill was highly valued, but individuality was quietly suppressed. That doesn't mean artists had no influence at all. Small details, subtle expressions, slight variations in composition, these were the areas where personality could slip through, but those moments were limited, almost hidden within a larger structure that demanded control. So even after becoming a recognised artist, your role wasn't to innovate freely, it was to execute perfectly. Because in the world of medieval guilds, the goal wasn't to stand out, it was to get it right. By the time you became a full member of a guild, you had skills, experience, and years of training behind you. But there was one thing you still didn't fully have: your own identity as an artist. Because in medieval workshops, the focus wasn't on the individual, it was on the collective. When a master artist ran a workshop, he didn't work alone. He had apprentices, journeymen, assistants, all contributing to the same projects. Large commissions, especially altarpieces or murals, required multiple hands. One person prepared the surface, another painted backgrounds, another worked on clothing, and only the master handled the most important details: faces, hands, and final touches. The result was a finished piece that looked unified but was actually built by many. And yet, only one name mattered: the master's. Even if a journeyman painted half the scene, or an apprentice contributed significant portions, their names were not recorded. The artwork belonged to the workshop, and the workshop belonged to the master. Credit flowed upward, never outward. This creates a strange reality when you look back at medieval art today. Many works we attribute to a single artist were, in truth, collaborative efforts. The style we recognize wasn't just one person's vision. It was a system, repeated and refined by multiple hands working under strict guidance. For the artists inside that system, this meant accepting a kind of anonymity. You could be incredibly skilled, even essential to the creation of major works, and still remain unknown. Your contribution would exist, but your name wouldn't. Recognition wasn't part of the deal. Belonging to the guild was, and that wasn't always optional. Guilds often required artists to work within established workshops, rather than independently. Setting up your own operation without approval could lead to fines, penalties, or complete exclusion from the profession. In other words, stepping outside the system wasn't just risky, it could end your career. So instead of building personal brands or unique artistic identities, most artists built reputations within the guild itself. They became known among peers and patrons, but rarely beyond that. It's a very different world from what we imagine today. Now, artists are defined by their individuality. Their signature matters. Their style is their identity. Back then, it was the opposite. Your skill mattered. Your work mattered. But your name? That was optional. By the time you finally reached the level of a master, you might think the hardest part was over. Years of apprenticeship, endless labour, constant supervision. You've done it all. Now you're ready to open your own workshop, take on commissions, and finally have control. Except, you still need permission. In medieval guilds, becoming a master didn't automatically grant you independence. It gave you the possibility of it. And that possibility came with conditions, strict ones. First, you needed approval from the guild itself. That meant proving not only your skill, but your reliability, your connections, and sometimes even your financial stability. Opening a workshop wasn't just about talent, it was about trust. The guild needed to believe that you wouldn't damage its reputation or undercut its standards. And even if you were approved, there were limits. Guilds often controlled how many masters could operate in a city at any given time. Too many artists meant competition. Competition meant lower prices, and lower prices threatened the entire system. So even if you were qualified, you could be denied simply because there was no space for you. Imagine reaching the highest level in your craft, only to be told, yes, you're good enough, but not right now. Then there were the financial barriers. Opening a workshop required tools, materials, space, and often a fee paid directly to the guild. For many artists, especially those without wealthy patrons or family support, this was a serious obstacle. Skill alone didn't open doors, money did. And let's say you overcame all of that. You got approval, gathered resources, and opened your workshop. Even then, you weren't fully free. Guilds imposed rules on how you operated, what you could produce, how much you could charge, even how many apprentices you could take. Your business wasn't entirely yours. It was part of a larger system that constantly monitored and regulated it. Break those rules, and the consequences were immediate. Fines, loss of commissions, or worse, expulsion from the guild, which effectively ended your career. So becoming a master wasn't the end of control. It was just a new level of it. Because in medieval guilds, success didn't mean freedom. It meant responsibility, under supervision. By the time you finally reached the level of a master and managed to open a workshop, you might think your personal life was your own. After all, you had earned your place, proven your skill, and secured your position. But even here the guild had opinions. And sometimes those opinions extended into something as personal as marriage. In many medieval cities, guilds weren't just professional organizations, they were social networks, almost like closed communities. Your connections mattered, who you associated with mattered, and yes, who you married could directly affect your career. Marrying within the guild circle was often encouraged, and in some cases, practically expected. If you married the daughter or widow of a master, you didn't just gain a partner. You gained status, stability, and often access to an established workshop. It was one of the fastest ways to secure your position in the system. In fact, for some men, marriage wasn't just personal, it was strategic. A widow of a master might inherit her late husband's workshop, and by marrying her, a journeyman could step directly into that role. It sounds almost transactional, and in many ways it was. Emotional connection may have existed, but practicality often came first. But there was another side to this. Marrying outside the guild, especially into a lower social class, could raise concerns. It wasn't always outright forbidden, but it could affect how you were perceived. Guilds valued reputation, and reputation was tied to stability, reliability, and social standing. A poor marriage choice could quietly limit opportunities or weaken your position among peers. Even more restrictive, some guilds had formal or informal rules about when you could marry. Apprentices, for example, were often not allowed to marry during their training years. The reasoning was simple. Marriage meant responsibility, distraction, and divided focus. The guild wanted your full attention, so even something as personal as starting a family was tied to your professional progress. What makes this particularly strange is how normal it was at the time. No one saw this as intrusive. It was simply part of the system. Your work, your status, your relationships, they were all interconnected. Today, we separate career and personal life as much as possible. Back then, they were inseparable. Because in the world of medieval guilds, you didn't just build a career. You built a life that fit within the system, or you struggled outside of it. By now, the pattern is clear. Medieval guilds didn't just organize artists, they controlled them. And one of the strangest rules of all was this. You weren't supposed to compete, at least not openly. In a modern sense, competition drives creativity. Artists push boundaries, undercut prices, experiment with new styles to stand out. But in a medieval guild, that kind of behavior wasn't admired, it was dangerous. Guilds were built on stability. They wanted predictable quality, consistent pricing, and controlled output. If one artist started charging less to attract more clients, it threatened everyone else. If someone began producing faster or experimenting wildly, it disrupted the balance. So the solution was simple: limit competition. Guilds often set fixed price ranges for certain types of work. You couldn't just decide to offer cheaper paintings to gain clients. That would be seen as undercutting your fellow members, and it could lead to fines or disciplinary action. In extreme cases, it could get you expelled. And without guild membership, your career effectively ended. But it went beyond pricing. You weren't supposed to aggressively pursue another master's clients. Stealing commissions wasn't just frowned upon. It was a violation of trust within the guild. The system relied on a kind of mutual agreement. Everyone would get their share, and no one would disrupt the order. Of course, this doesn't mean rivalry didn't exist. It absolutely did. Artists still wanted recognition. They still wanted better commissions, more prestigious projects, and higher status. But instead of open competition, it became quiet, subtle, expressed through quality rather than price, through connections rather than confrontation. It's almost ironic. A system designed to control competition ended up creating a different kind of pressure, one where artists had to stand out without appearing to try too hard. Too much ambition could be seen as disruptive, too little, and you'd be forgotten. And then there's the creative side. If you knew that stepping too far outside accepted norms could risk your position, how far would you really go? Would you experiment boldly, or would you stay safely within the lines? For many artists, the answer was obvious. Play it safe, because in medieval guilds, success wasn't about beating others. It was about not upsetting the system that allowed you to exist in the first place. By this point, it's clear that medieval guilds controlled artists themselves. But they didn't stop there. They also controlled the very materials artists used, not just loosely, but in surprisingly strict and detailed ways. Because in a guild system, quality wasn't optional. It had to be guaranteed. Take pigments, for example. Colours in medieval art weren't just aesthetic choices. They were valuable commodities. Some pigments were cheap and easy to produce, while others were incredibly rare and expensive. Ultramarine blue, made from crushed lapis lazuli, was worth more than its weight in gold. So naturally, the guilds made sure it was used correctly. You couldn't just decide to swap a cheaper blue for a more expensive one and hope no one noticed. That was fraud. If a client paid for a painting using high-quality materials, you were expected to deliver exactly that. Guild inspectors could examine your work, and if they found you cutting corners, using lower-grade pigments, poor wood, or inferior gold leaf, you could be fined or punished. And yes, inspections were real. Guilds had officials who checked workshops, ensuring that standards were maintained. Think of it less like a creative environment and more like a controlled production system, where consistency mattered as much as skill. Even the preparation process was regulated. Panels had to be properly treated. Layers of gesso had to be applied correctly. Paint mixtures had to follow established methods. You weren't just judged on the final image, but on how you got there. A poorly prepared surface could crack or fade over time, and that reflected badly not just on you, but on the entire guild. So experimentation wasn't just risky, it could be punished. Trying a new technique or material might lead to unexpected results, and unexpected results were the last thing guilds wanted. Reliability came first. If a method had worked for generations, that was the method you were expected to use. Of course, some artists still experimented quietly. Small changes, subtle adjustments, hidden innovations that wouldn't attract attention. But anything too obvious could bring consequences. It creates a strange image of medieval art. We often imagine artists as free creators, exploring colour, texture and form. But in reality, even the paint in their hands was part of a regulated system. Because in medieval guilds, creativity didn't just have boundaries, even your materials did. By now, it's obvious that medieval guilds controlled training, materials, prices, and even personal life. But there was one more layer. Something less visible, but just as powerful. They controlled style, not in a written rule book that said, paint like this and not like that, but through expectations so strong that breaking them could actually get you into trouble. Because in a guild system, consistency mattered more than individuality. Clients expected familiar images, recognizable compositions, and predictable quality, and the guild made sure they got exactly that. If a painter suddenly decided to radically change how figures looked, stretching proportions, altering expressions, experimenting with perspective, it could be seen as risky, not innovative. Risky, because it might confuse clients, damage trust, or make the workshop look unreliable. And that had consequences. Guilds could reject your work, refuse to approve commissions, or even penalise you if your style strayed too far from accepted norms. Not because it was bad, but because it didn't fit. Think about that for a second. You could be highly skilled, technically perfect, and still face problems simply because your work looked different. This is why so much medieval art feels visually consistent. Saints resemble other saints. Scenes follow familiar layouts. Expressions repeat across different artists and regions. It wasn't a lack of imagination. It was a system reinforcing repetition. Because repetition was safe, that doesn't mean individuality disappeared completely. It just became subtle. Artists found small ways to express themselves. Slight variations in facial expressions, unique details in clothing, hidden signatures within larger compositions, but these were quiet differences, almost like whispers inside a much louder structure. Anything too bold could draw attention, and attention in this context wasn't always a good thing. There's also an economic side to this. Patrons didn't want surprises. If they commissioned a religious painting, they expected something familiar, something that aligned with tradition and belief. An artist who delivered something too unconventional risked losing future work. Not just for themselves, but potentially damaging the reputation of their entire guild. So the system reinforced itself. Stay within the lines and you succeed. Step outside them and you risk everything. Which makes one thing clear. Medieval artists didn't lack creativity. They just had to hide it carefully, inside a world that valued control over originality. After everything, the years of apprenticeship, the strict rules, the control over style, materials, prices, and even personal life, you might expect some kind of reward at the end. A moment where an artist finally becomes free. But here's the truth. In medieval guilds, that moment rarely came. Even as a master, even with your own workshop, you were still part of the system, still bound by its expectations, its regulations, its quiet pressure to conform. You could succeed within it. You could gain respect, wealth, even influence. But true creative freedom? That was limited. And the strangest part is this. The artists we remember most are often the ones who, in some way, moved beyond those limits. As Europe began to shift toward the Renaissance, something started to change. Patronage evolved. Wealthy individuals and powerful families began commissioning art directly, sometimes outside the strict control of guilds. Artists slowly gained more independence, more recognition, and more room to experiment. Names began to matter. Individual style began to matter. And for the first time, artists could start to be seen not just as skilled workers, but as creators with unique visions. But this didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, uneven, and often resisted by the guilds themselves, who had spent centuries maintaining control. Letting go of that control meant risking instability, something they had always tried to avoid. Still, the shift was inevitable, because creativity has a way of pushing against boundaries, even when those boundaries are deeply rooted in tradition. And eventually, the system that once defined art began to loosen its grip. Looking back, it creates a strange contrast. The medieval guild system produced incredible works, precise, consistent, technically impressive, but it did so by limiting the very thing we now associate with art: individuality. And yet, without that system, many artists would never have developed the skills that later allowed them to break free. So in a way, the rules that restricted them also shaped them. But here's the final irony. The moment artists truly became free was the moment they started leaving the guild system behind.